Good afternoon. We're going to start our conference. We have just seen a very interesting panel on the transport sector, especially on cybersecurity on the transport sector, and it has been discussed. The new challenges in this sector have been discussed, especially taking into account that this world is increasingly interconnected. Our target is to focus on one of the main elements of the transport sector, the railway sector, and we are going to show you an effective collaboration example whose aim is to increase the cybersecurity level of these infrastructures. Before giving the floor to my colleague, I am going to place this sector into its context, because we need to understand the world of railway sector in order to understand what we have done. One of the main objectives of the railway sector is to transport cargo or to transport passengers. Trains are one of the most commonly used means of transport by the general public. We have some figures by the Ministry of Promotion that says that in 2018, over 507 million passengers used this transport, and 18 million tons of cargo were also conveyed in this means of transport. And this sector can have an impact on the economy, on the global economy, of course. One other of the key factors is the mobility, which is key for this sector. There are more and more demand of mobility, not only for passengers, but also for goods and cargoes. So in the end, the trend will be that when somebody wants to move from one place to another one, this person will buy a ticket, and it will simplify its life with that ticket with everything included. Secondly, the digitalization is also key in this sector, and because this sector is being liberalized. The National Commission for Competence says that as for the liberalization of the sector, this could increase by 40 or 50% the operational ability of managing the network. What does this mean? That the opportunities arising in this sector are very important. And what is the value chain for this industry? On the one hand, we have the network operators, so ADIF, AVE, and so on the operators of the network, such as RENFE, and the companies which build the infrastructure, because all of them need to work together in order to make the system work correctly. That is why it is important to understand and to take into account the whole value chain. The railway sector is leader at a global level. Many SMEs and large companies within these value chains are leading the sector regarding their business models. So we need to take all those elements into account. And then I'm going to give the floor to Francisco, but before, why is cybersecurity important? Cybersecurity needs to be addressed in a global way, and we need to also carry out a general analysis. It is true that in the beginning we were focusing on the finalization and on the embedded systems. But what else is going on in this sector? As the access to information is free, last week, for example, a group of Russian investigators published a report which includes vulnerabilities in the railway sector. This could be helpful in order to improve the sector. However, if it falls in malicious hands, it can become a problem. So, Francisco, what do you think that was beneficial for INCIBE and RENFE to work together? We saw that the Internet of Things was entering the railway sector, because in France there is a train that operates with 50,000 sensors, and some trains can have some information systems. Nowadays in Spain, this is not as important as it is in France, because the Internet of Things is usually aimed at proactive maintenance and so on. However, this made us reflect upon the fact that we needed to take steps towards the Internet of Things in the railway sector. Recently, we are integrating cybersecurity requirements in our procurement plans, and we realized that we are facing a huge problem regarding the maturity of the operator. We need to comply with certain regulations. However, as regulation works today, those obligations and requirements begin and end in us. This is not completely true, because obviously some providers need to comply with certain regulations, but the market is not aware of it. And in the field of in the railway sector, the same thing happens. As regulation doesn't force people to comply with regulations, we need to be in charge of it. But the market is not mature enough, so on many occasions people do not know how to interpret the data. That made us think, my colleagues and I, that it would be a good idea to have a work group where we could discuss about the security requirements and the material levels we needed to reach. At that point, we decided that INCIBE could contribute with value. Why? Because we thought that since they are also developing sectorial guidelines, they could develop good guidelines of good practices. Because when you work together with other colleagues, time depends on each person, and value is also dependent on each person. So the difficult tasks of making what we discussed a reality was difficult, but it was possible thanks to this work group, because this work group would also incorporate providers, and it is included in a national and international work group. Yeah, the main milestones of this cluster have been launched recently. It started in July, and nowadays we are over 10 organizations within this cluster, and we invite everyone to participate in this joint initiative. We had three main targets: to review technical specification, which is being worked on at a European level, and that affects directly to this sector. And obviously, Spain had to be represented by ADIF and RENFE. We needed to foresee some practices by RENFE, and finally, we needed to see how this whole sector is considered at an European level. This technical specification aims at being represented in every country. If there is consensus, it will be easier to apply or to implement some solutions. In order to conclude, this initiative is quite important. But how is this related to other European initiatives? Before answering to that question, I would like to highlight that the current regulation is based on the 72433, which means that there are some things lacking, because we need to take into account new systems and traditional systems, and that's what we need to do to comply with the regulation, but this regulation should take into account other aspects. And that's why we need to work at a national level and to have somebody to advocate for it at an international level. And that's what we do in this cluster in the European Forum. And how this initiative is related to other initiatives. Well, there is a ISAC initiative from the European Union, an initiative by the United Nations, also initiative in the railway sector, and one initiative related to certification of services. But I think we need to work more on this. That is why we came with the idea of creating this national cluster, because an international regulation can take 3 years if everything works okay. European regulations, due to its mechanisms, can be faster, but the standard average time is 3 years. So we wanted to start on working on guides for good practices that could be included in other standards or even regulations. For example, the certification part could be included in the certification part of the European level related to the railway sector, and that is part of our target, to make it rentable, to make it profitable, because if we are doing many things at the same time, in the end you're not productive. So we need to have a strategic perspective. We need to see how many work groups there are in order for us to have an influence, because if you have an influence, you can feel that that regulation is appropriate and is in line with your way of working. Well, I think those are the conclusions on the advances of these initiatives that could serve as an example for other sectors, because working together will make us work better and increase the level of security. I think this is all for us. Maybe we have enough time for a brief question.
Aquí, por favor.
Thank you very much. Just a brief question. And probably it's because I do not know. I think your initiative is very interesting. Well, yeah, the question is for both of you. What pace of incorporation of IT and OT of new generation does the railway system have? I do not know if this goes, if it is divided into generations such as 4G and 5G, or are you incorporating updates as manufacturer includes updates? Well, yeah, obviously it depends on manufacturing and also on engineering. So obviously this is related to a specific engineering by the manufacturer. But regardless the manufacturing process or the engineering process, the standardization will make sure that we have some standards. So embedded OT devices, for example, we need to incorporate security measures in that regard. You know that I'm a bit obsessed with the fact that manufacturers need to have a head of information security, because without that, the company won't be able to carry out good practices. So that is one of our conditioning requirements, to have a person in charge of information security. And thanks to this new requirement, one of the companies in the sector have already created a department and hired a person in charge of information security. Thank you very much for your question. We're going to close the session now. Thank you, Francisco, for your collaboration and proactivity in order to push initiatives like this one, and thank you for your participation. Thank you, all of you, for your attention, and without further ado, this session is closed.